The Jordan River is formed by four major springs at the north of Israel at the base of Mount Hermon. The largest spring emerges at the ancient city of Dan, where the Israelite tribe settled. In Judges 18:10, this site was described as a place where no natural resource is lacking. The city of Dan was often used to mark the northern end of the territory of Israel, as in the phrase, "from Dan to Beersheba." During the time of the kings, the city of Dan became a center of idolatry when King Jeroboam built a high place here with a golden calf. Today, the site is uninhabited, but the Dan Spring continues to produce abundant water that flows down the Jordan River and into the Sea of Galilee. 14 miles north of the Sea of Galilee, the city of Hazor was known as the chief of all those kingdoms in the days of the Canaanites. This formidable site was the largest in all of Canaan, and its massive fortifications have been evacuated by archaeologists. Hazor was conquered from the Canaanites twice, first by Joshua and later by Deborah. When Solomon became king, he embarked on a campaign to fortify the most strategic cities in his empire, including Hazor. Excavations have revealed this monumental gatehouse that was constructed by Solomon. The design of the gate is strikingly similar to those found at Megiddo and Gezer, providing confirmation of the biblical account given in 1 Kings 9. The Jordan River was and is a significant landmark in the land of Israel. Several key events happened along the river in biblical times. Jacob crossed the Jordan into Canaan in Genesis 32. Joshua and the Israelites crossed into the Promised Land when the waters of the Jordan were miraculously stopped in Joshua 3. And Elisha made an axe head float after it had sunk in the Jordan River in 2 Kings 6. In the time of Jesus, the Jordan River was the divider between the territory of Galilee, which was ruled by Herod Antipas, and Golan, which was ruled by Herod Philip. Today, much of the river forms the border between the countries of Israel and Jordan. Throughout history, the land of Israel has been a good place for herding sheep. Although during the day shepherds graze their sheep out in the open fields, at night they may herd them into a sheepfold for protection like the one shown here. David may have used such sheepfolds when he was a shepherd boy, and they would also have been common in Jesus' day. After the sheep are inside, the shepherd lays down in the doorway. This is what Jesus meant when he said, "I am the gate for the sheep," in John 10:7. In biblical times, the best way a person could protect their property was by building a watchtower. 2 passages of Scripture mention watchtowers being built in vineyards. In the Old Testament, Isaiah 5:1-2 states, "My friend had a vineyard on a fertile hillside. He spaded it, cleared it of stones, and planted the choicest vines. Within it he built a watchtower and hewed out a winepress." In the New Testament, in Matthew 21:33, Matthew states, "Hear another parable. There was a landowner who planted a vineyard, put a hedge around it, dug a winepress in it, and built a tower. Then he leased it to tenants and went on a journey." In both passages, a watchtower was one of the necessary elements to a preparing of a good vineyard. Megiddo was a major city in biblical times, and its history spanned over 1,000 years. It was located along the main highway that ran from Egypt to Mesopotamia, and it sat in front of an important pass over Mount Carmel. Although Joshua conquered the city, the Israelites couldn't settle there because the Canaanite population was still strong. Later, the city was probably conquered by David. 1 Kings 9 tells us that Solomon fortified Megiddo, Gezer, and Hazor, and archaeologists have discovered identical gates at those 3 sites. The gate at Megiddo is shown here, but half of it has been removed by the excavators. Revelation 16:16 tells us that Megiddo will play a part in the end-time events. They then assembled the kings in the place that is named Armageddon in Hebrew, which is translated, Armageddon simply means the hill of Megiddo. Mount Tabor sits at the eastern end of the Jezreel Valley, 11 miles west of the Sea of Galilee. Its elevation at the summit is 1,843 feet high. Because it rises so dramatically, it has always been a significant landmark. Two biblical events are associated with this mountain. The first is Barak's battle against Sisera in Judges 4. Following the instruction of Deborah, Barak gathered 10,000 men onto this mountain and led them to victory against Sisera's 900 iron chariots and his army. The second event associated with Mount Tabor is the Transfiguration of Jesus. Many of the church fathers believe that the Transfiguration took place on Mount Tabor, including Cyril of Jerusalem, Epiphanius, and Jerome. However, another church father, Eusebius, was uncertain if it took place on Mount Tabor or on Mount Hermon. Archaeologists have discovered that there was a Roman fort here during the time of Christ, so the Transfiguration probably took place somewhere else. At its highest point, Mount Carmel reaches 1,810 feet above sea level. Its name means orchard with fruit trees and vines. The mountain stands in a long chain that runs northwest to southeast for nearly 15 miles. It ranges from 3 to 8 miles in width and has pronounced cliffs on either side. In ancient times, it was a sacred place, and a variety of gods have been worshipped here. For example, the Canaanites worshipped Baal on this mountain. Later, during the reign of King Ahab, Mount Carmel was the setting of Elijah's confrontation with the priests of Baal and Asherah. On that day, God sent fire out of heaven onto Elijah's altar on Mount Carmel as a sign of his power and authority. Pictured here are the modern walls of Jerusalem. They were built by Suleiman the Magnificent, a Muslim ruler, in the 16th century A.D. They were built on older foundations with parts of older walls sometimes incorporated into the new walls. So some of the walls probably stand where they did in biblical times. The average height of the walls is about 35 feet, but at the highest point they stand 50 feet tall. There are 35 square towers around the city. The circumference of the walls is about 3 miles, and the area inside is about 1 square mile. During the time of David and Solomon, Jerusalem became the capital of Israel and a place that had a special association with God. This association is heard in Psalm 48. Great is the Lord, and highly praised in the city of our God. Go about Zion, walk all around it. Note the number of its towers. Consider the ramparts, examine its citadels, that you may tell future generations, yes, so mighty is God, our God who leads us always. Located in the Kidron Valley near Jerusalem, the Pillar of Absalom is the tallest and most complete tomb monument in Israel, standing 63 feet high. Most of the tower, square part of the structure, was cut out of the Mount of Olives, next to which it stands. The tomb was associated with Absalom by pilgrims because of 2 Samuel 18:18, which says, "During his lifetime, Absalom had taken a pillar and erected it for himself in the king's valley, for he said, 'I have no son to perpetuate my name.'" However, this monument was built about 1,000 years later in the 1st century A.D. and is not connected to the Old Testament figure. A 4th century inscription on the tomb mentions Zechariah, the father of John the Baptist, and reflects the belief that this tomb belonged to Zechariah. Snow in Jerusalem may be surprising to some people, but it does occur about once every 2 or 3 years. The Dead Sea is the lowest point on Earth, sitting 1,300 feet below sea level. It is over 40 miles long and 11 miles wide at its widest point. Although a number of rivers and streams flow into the Dead Sea, there is no river that flows out of it. The only way water leaves the sea is by evaporation. Because of this, the sea has a high level of minerals. It is nearly 10 times as salty as the ocean and twice as salty as the Great Salt Lake in Utah. The Dead Sea Works Company on the southwest side of the lake employs 1,600 people around the clock to harvest the valuable minerals from the water. This picture of the Dead Sea was taken from En-Gedi, a site on the western shore where a spring supplies fresh water. According to 1 Samuel 23 and 24, David and his men hid from Saul in this area. Ein Parat is a spring located a few miles northeast of Jerusalem. In Jeremiah 13:5, God tells Jeremiah to hide his loincloth at a certain place. Most Bible versions translate that place as the Euphrates River, but more likely it should be translated as Parat, referring to this spring. It is situated in an area where shepherds pasture their sheep. The calm waters pictured here illustrate what David had in mind when he wrote in Psalm 23, "In green pastures you let me graze, to safe waters you lead me." These still waters are a picture of God's provision for His people. Genesis 23 records that Abraham purchased a plot of ground in Hebron, including a burial cave for his wife Sarah. Later, Abraham, Isaac, Rebekah, Jacob, and Leah were all buried here. About 2,000 years later, shortly before Jesus was born, Herod the Great built an enclosure around the cave to remember the patriarch's tomb. This enclosure is shown here. The style of the building is similar to that of the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. Large stones were used, there is no mortar between the stones, and engaged columns decorate the outside. The largest stones are near the corners to strengthen them, and the largest one is more than 24 feet long and 4.5 feet high. This building is one of the most well-preserved structures built by King Herod, and it was standing during the time of Christ. Although Jesus was raised in Nazareth, he moved to Capernaum soon after beginning his public ministry. It then was considered his hometown. Mark 2:1 states, "When Jesus returned to Capernaum after some days, it became known that he was at home." Capernaum was an important city in Jesus' day. It was situated along the shore of the Sea of Galilee, and possibly 1,500 people could have lived there at one point. It was without a doubt a fishing town, since hooks and other fishing equipment have been found here. The city was also situated along a major international highway. Most of the traffic going north or south would most likely go through this crucial junction. This made Capernaum an ideal place for the center of Jesus' ministry, as word of his teaching and miracles would be carried by travelers passing through Capernaum. Today, the ruins of Capernaum are owned by two churches. The Franciscans control the western portion with the synagogue, and the Greek Orthodox have the property that is marked by the white church with red domes. Pictured here is the synagogue of Capernaum. John 6 records that Jesus taught the people here, saying, "I am the bread of life." The synagogue shown here was actually built after the time of Christ, but it was built on the foundations of the synagogue that stood in Jesus' day. This is the largest and most impressive of all the synagogues in Galilee. A short distance away is the site of Peter's house. Many of Jesus' miracles were performed in Capernaum's synagogue, in Peter's house, or elsewhere in the city. Yet in spite of all the miracles that the people saw here, the town was later cursed by Christ for its unbelief. This is the traditional hill where Jesus was nearly thrown off by the angry mob of Nazareth. Luke 4 records, "When the people in the synagogue heard this, they were all filled with fury. They rose up, drove him out of the town, and led him to the brow of the hill on which their town had been built, to hurl him down headlong. But he passed through the midst of them and went away." Jesus noted in this regard that no prophet is accepted in his own native place. Up until that point, Nazareth had been the hometown of Jesus. The city was neither large nor important during Jesus' lifetime. It was merely a small agricultural village nestled in the hills of Galilee. The population was probably less than 200. Jesus visited Nazareth once more later in his ministry, but he did no miracles here except a few healings because of the people's unbelief. The Jordan River was one of the main locations for the ministry of John the Baptist. Mark 1:5 records, "People of the whole Judean countryside and all the inhabitants of Jerusalem were going out to him and were being baptized by him in the Jordan River as they acknowledged their sins." Among the crowd of people who came to be baptized by John was Jesus himself. Mark also writes, "On coming up out of the water, he saw the heavens being torn open and the Spirit like a dove descending upon him. And a voice came from the heavens, 'You are my beloved Son, with you I am well pleased.'" The width of the river today varies between 50 and 125 feet. Its depth is between 2 and 10 feet. The Jordan River contains 35 species of fish, and 16 of these are found only in the Jordan River. Unfortunately, the river is not in good condition today, since Israel and Jordan divert much of the water in the area to use for irrigation and other needs. The Sea of Galilee is more of a lake than a true sea. In the New Testament period, it was called a number of different names, including Sea of Galilee, Lake of Gennesaret, and Lake of Tiberias. It is 13 miles long and 7 miles wide. It covers an area of 64 square miles and has a circumference of about 32 miles. The depth varies, but is between about 160 and 200 feet. The Gospels speak often of either raging waters or calm seas on the Sea of Galilee. Particularly eventful was the display of Jesus' power when he calmed a storm with only his words. The peaceful calm of the lake can be transformed quickly by a violent storm. Winds funnel through the Galilee hills to the west and can quickly stir up the waters. Even more violent, however, are the winds that come off the hills of the Golan Heights to the east. Trapped in the basin, the winds can produce dangerous conditions. A recent storm in 1992 sent waves more than 10 feet high, crashing into downtown Tiberias, causing significant damage. Matthew 14 records how Jesus fed the 5,000. It says, "He ordered the crowds to sit down on the grass. Taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish and looking up to heaven, he said the blessing, broke the loaves and gave them to the disciples, who in turn gave them to the crowds. They all ate and were satisfied. Those who ate were about 5,000 men, not counting women and children." The Byzantine mosaic shown here was once part of a church which commemorated this event. The church was built around 450 AD and had a mosaic floor that included these 2 fish and loaves. The rest of the floor has pictures of plants and animals. Pictured here is the Mount of Beatitudes, the traditional site for Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. A Catholic church built in 1939 stands at the top of the hill. Although Scripture doesn't give a clear indication for where the Sermon on the Mount was delivered, the suggestion of this hill is a good one. This spacious hillside provides enough room for crowds to gather. For example, in the year 2000, when the Pope visited the site, there was room nearby for 100,000 people to observe Mass. Critics of the Bible have sometimes pointed out how Matthew records that this sermon was given on a hill, while Luke states that it was given on a plain. However, this alleged discrepancy is easily reconciled by observing the many level places on the Galilean hillsides, such as this one. During the construction of a road on Mount Carmel, this ancient rolling stone tomb was discovered near Megiddo. This type of tomb was common in Jesus' day, but only the wealthy could afford to hire workers to cut them out of the rock. Often a round stone was used to block the doorway. It sat in a grooved track and could be rolled back and forth. Inside, the bodies were placed in horizontal shafts or on burial shelves known as arcosolium. The shelves were usually cut into the wall of the tomb and had an arch above them. From the stories in the Gospels, it would seem that Jesus' tomb was of the shelf type. Pictured here is the city of Jerusalem, as it is seen from the Mount of Olives. At the bottom of the picture is part of the large Jewish cemetery on the Mount of Olives. Between the mountain and the city lies the Kidron Valley, and at the center of the picture is the Temple Mount with the blue and gold dome of the rock. To the far right is the Golden Gate. In the background lies the rest of the old city as well as the new city that has been built on the hills beyond. Jerusalem is much larger today than it was in biblical times. Jesus had a similar view of the city when he wept over the city, saying, "Jerusalem, Jerusalem, you who kill the prophets and stone those sent to you, how many times I yearned to gather your children together as a hen gathers her brood under her wings, but you were unwilling." Located on the southern side of the Temple Mount, these steps led to one of the Temple Mount's main gates in Jesus' day. The staircase was originally 215 feet wide and had 30 steps. Some of the original steps remain, and others have been reconstructed recently. Part of the staircase was cut out of bedrock. Although the height of each step is about the same, the treads of the steps are of different lengths. A wide step is followed by a narrow step, which is followed by another wide step, and so on. This requires someone walking on the staircase to take their time and move in a solemn manner. Since these stairs are the grandest of all the approaches to the Temple Mount, it is believed that it was the one most used by the masses. Therefore, Jesus and his disciples probably used these stairs when they would visit the temple. On the top of the Temple Mount today stands the Dome of the Rock. It is a Muslim structure that was built in the 7th century. Underneath the dome is a large rock where, according to Muslim teaching, Muhammad climbed a ladder into heaven and left behind a footprint in the stone. It is commonly believed that the Jewish temple stood in the same location. Since Muslims believe that their religion has superseded both Judaism and Christianity, they had a desire to show up their imperfect forerunners. This shrine supplanted the Jewish religion because it occupied their sacred location, and it bettered the Christians with its interior decoration, which is superior to that of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. At the eastern edge of the Temple Mount stands the Golden Gate. It was built around 640 A.D., possibly in honor of Emperor Heraclius, who led a triumphal procession bringing the Holy Cross from Persia to Jerusalem. The gate was frequently used in the early Islamic period, was used only twice a year during the Crusader period, and was eventually closed in the late Islamic period. Christian tradition identifies this eastern gate with the one that the Messiah will return through when he returns in the end of times. Muslim tradition also associates this gate with a final judgment, and a Muslim cemetery now lies around the Golden Gate. Shown here is a cave in the Mount of Olives that is associated with the Garden of Gethsemane. During the Byzantine period, Christians visited this cave and believed that it commemorated the location of the garden. During the time of Christ, the cave was used for pressing olives to make olive oil. It has been suggested that since the press would not have been used during Passover, Jesus and his disciples may have used the cave for meeting and sleeping. It is possible that Jesus left his disciples here to pray while he went off privately with Peter, James, and John into the Garden of Gethsemane. Today, in a nearby area, stands an olive garden with 8 large and ancient olive trees. Scholars estimate the age of these trees to be between 1,000 and 2,000 years old. It is unlikely that these are the same trees that existed in the time of Christ, because the Romans cut down all the trees in the area during their siege of Jerusalem in 70 A.D. However, the cave and the trees stand as a memorial to the events in the Garden of Gethsemane the night before Jesus was crucified. Between the Dead Sea and the cities of Judah lies the Judean wilderness. Because of its lack of water and good routes, this wilderness has been mostly uninhabited throughout history. Consequently, it was an ideal place for those seeking refuge from enemies or retreat from the world. When on the run from King Saul, David hid in various places in the Judean wilderness. Shortly before the time of Christ, Herod the Great built 2 fortresses in this area, Herodium and Masada. He intended to use them for protection if his people ever revolted against him. John the Baptist preached here, and it seems likely that this was the wilderness where Jesus was tempted. It is a barren place, but can be used during some seasons of the year for grazing sheep. This is the monastery of St. Peter, which marks the traditional site of Peter's vision of the Great Sheet in Acts 10. It is located in the coastal city of Jaffa. Jaffa is an ancient city and was called Joppa in biblical times. In Solomon's day, cedars were floated to Joppa from Phoenicia and then dragged up to Jerusalem for the construction of the temple. Later in the Old Testament period, Jonah sailed for Tarshish from Joppa. In the New Testament period, Peter came to Joppa to raise Tabitha from the dead. Later he stayed at the house of Simon the tanner in this city. When Peter was praying on the roof, he had a vision of a large sheet filled with animals being lowered from heaven, and from then on, the gospel was preached to the Gentiles. Near the Dead Sea, in several different caves, Bedouins and archaeologists discovered the Dead Sea Scrolls in the 1940s. Pictured here is the most famous of those caves, called Cave 4. Inside, more than 15,000 fragments from over 200 books were found, including 122 biblical scrolls and fragments. These scrolls were poorly preserved because they were not in jars, but they date to the New Testament period. Nearby, archaeologists have excavated a small settlement known as Qumran. It is commonly believed that a community of Essenes lived here around the time of Christ and produced the Dead Sea Scrolls. This rolling stone tomb is located at a place called Khirbet Midras, about 15 miles southwest of Jerusalem. It dates to shortly after the time of Christ, but shares many features with the tomb where Jesus' body was laid after the crucifixion. It was cut from stone and had a round stone that covered the doorway. This stone rolled in a channel that was formed by two walls and was large like the one at Jesus' tomb. The women who came to anoint Jesus' body wondered who would move that stone for them. The doorway is low, just like Jesus' tomb was. The Bible tells us that John had to stoop to look inside. This tomb also has an outer courtyard where mourners would come. Such a courtyard may have been where the Roman soldiers stood guard. One of the cities visited by Paul during his missionary journeys was the city of Ephesus in Asia Minor. Pictured here is the most well-known structure in Ephesus, the Library of Celsus. Built in the 2nd century A.D., it once contained 12,000 scrolls stored in niches in the walls. Paul spent 3 years planting a church in Ephesus and wrote the book of 1 Corinthians here. The main religion in the city was the worship of the goddess Artemis. As the patron goddess of the city, her temple stood there for hundreds of years, but the successful ministry of Paul was considered a threat to her worship. Ephesus was a strategic location for Paul's ministry since it was a center of travel and commerce. Situated on the Aegean Sea at the mouth of a river, the city was one of the greatest seaports of the ancient world and had major roads leading to it from every direction. The remains of a bathhouse overlook the Aegean Sea in the ancient city of Troas. Located at the northwestern tip of Asia Minor, Troas was an important seaport during the Roman period. Acts 16 tells us that during Paul's second missionary journey, the Holy Spirit prevented him from going into Asia, which lies to the south of Troas, or into Bithynia, which lies to the east of it. Instead, while he was in Troas, he received a vision of a Macedonian man who said, "Come over to Macedonia and help us." As a result, Paul headed across the sea to Macedonia. Luke probably joined Paul in Troas. On his third missionary journey, Paul stayed in Troas for a week, teaching the people there. In his last letter to Timothy, soon before his death, he requested that Timothy bring some items to him, including a cloak that he had left in Troas.